got to. Okay, so thank you. I'm going to start by admitting the reason I read the Leviathan and why I've been saying for ages I'm going to talk about it is largely because I was reeled in by this fantastic cover picture from the Leviathan. Okay, so strictly speaking, this is not a cover picture, this is a frontispiece, because the book was published in 1651 and they didn't do printing pictures onto the front cover of a book, as you could get nowadays, and I don't even have the picture on the front cover of my copy of the book, but nonetheless, this is essentially the front cover picture, except it would have been printed on the inside front cover, facing the page that tells you the title and the things about the book. And this picture is a splendid fantasy picture. It shows the looming figure of the sovereign overseeing and keeping the peace in this town below him. And if you look closely at the picture of the sovereign, which could mean it could mean a king, or it could mean Oliver Cromwell, or it could also mean a composite person, not an individual person, but a parliament. You can see that the armour, or possibly the body, but I think the armour of the sovereign is actually made up of small, not bits of chainmail, but actually people going about their work. So there's some merchants doing some trading and some businessmen. And then there's some peasants like me who are just being sent about their work. And so this is a summary which Hobbes put together with the artist of his theory of what a state is, that the state is this sort of composite person which oversees the world and keeps order. That's actually the top half of the picture. So the whole picture is this one, so that it's got the really impressive art at the top, and then it's got on the bottom, it's got to each side, it's got it's got pictures representing the two main strands of power within the state. So it has on the left the military power, so a castle and a cannon. And on the right-hand side, it's got civil power. It's got a law court and a college. And so all of those things together are the strands which Hobbes talks about in his book as forming the state. And he's really asking the question, how does a state or a government come to exist, and how should it be set up in order to avoid the problems which he lived through, namely the English Civil War and the 30 Years' War in Europe, and endless civil strife. So he asked the question, how can we put a stop to this by a more reasonably and scientifically thought out state? And he thought, well, I need to ask this question because the people who've come before me are wrong, basically. This is Hobbes would have he certainly did say this. So his view was that not having improperly put together government is what led to the civil wars and trouble. And he asked, how can we solve this problem? But to put it in modern terms, he was asking the question, why is it that when I go outside in the morning, it's not just a riot? And why is it not everything on fire and people trying to club each other to death with tinned food or whatever? Why do people get on with each other? Or at least why, normally, when things haven't broken down into civil war, do people get on with each other? And why can we come into work and basically people are quite civil to each other, and we make great progress together? And we can have imported tea and all of the other fruits of our joint labour. Okay. So in order to answer this question, he said, we need a new theory, a scientific theory fit for the 17th century, not the competing earlier theory, which is scholastic Aristotelianism, which he said was giving the wrong answer and was leading us astray into problems. Okay, so in this talk, this is, as usual, this is going to be me talking about a subject which I thought was interesting and which has some, I think, very useful conclusions for you. But I'm not claiming to be an expert who's going to give the last word on this book. This is my book review. So I'll start by talking about this name, the Leviathan. I'll show you a picture of the Leviathan. And I'll talk a bit about Hobbes' biography. And I'll talk a bit about the previous political theory which he's replacing with this book, and also some of his contemporary political theory to show you what other ideas were around at the time. I will then talk briefly about the relevance of the Leviathan today. So I think it's a very good thing that you should learn about, you should know about, if, and in engineering you're quite likely to do this, if you work or live under lots of government regulations, which we do, or if you ever contribute towards writing government regulations, then I think it would be practically very useful, even in engineering, for you to know the political principles which these laws are based on, so that you can see how might I write some sensible laws. I'm not going to talk about some of the later people, even though I prefer John Locke, so I don't... Let me put a stop to the idea I'm suggesting if you write laws you should interpret Hobbes literally, but nonetheless you should have an idea what his views are as a starting point. Okay, I hope that's clear. Now, the Leviathan. So the Leviathan is pictured here. This is not quite a photograph, but this is a representation of this great sea monster, the Leviathan, which would have been familiar to Hobbes's readers from its biblical description in the book of Job. And the description is quite long, and I think it's a bit of a pantomime description because it starts with a long series of questions about the Leviathan. And I think it's almost as if the audience is supposed to answer these questions. So you're asked, can you reel in Leviathan with a fish hook? Or snare his tongue with a fishing line? And so then you look at the picture and you're supposed to answer, no, I couldn't possibly reel him in with a fish hook. Can you put a cord through his nose? Or pierce his jaw with a hook? You look at that. No, too strongly armoured. No, couldn't do that. Will he make many supplications to you? In other words, is this thing going to be in fear of you? No, it's not. And it goes on like that. Then I've skipped forward to a material science line, which I quite liked. That iron has straw to him, and bronze as rotten wood, and so on. There's a lot of description to do with the Leviathan, and the fact that he has these powerful armour scales, which make him invincible, and he has these huge teeth, which he can crush things with. And nothing on earth is his equal. He is a creature without fear. He looks down on all that are haughty. He is king over all that are proud. Okay, so on a deeper level, fear and pride are two of the themes of human nature which Hobbes talks about, but skipping over that, why is the Leviathan a good representation of Hobbes's theory for the front of his book? Well, because it illustrates two of the ideas he talks about. So first of all, materialism. The Leviathan is made of lots of different material parts. It's a sort of composite creature. So talking about it has these armour scales and it has these teeth. Each of them are individual bits. And it's in a very similar way to that Hobbes says the state is made up of individual people, each of which is a composite part, in a very similar way. And I'll read you Hobbes's introduction about this. But the key idea is that Hobbes he's writing in the 17th century, and he's saying, okay, my scientific theory needs to be materialist. I need to consider how governments are put together, which is going to depend on ethics or morality, and I need to know how this morality is coming out of people who are, in his view, completely material, like the components of Leviathan. So just in terms of this composite creature, I'll read out to you. This is materialism in action. So, seeing that life is but a motion of limbs, the beginning whereof is in some principal part within the material, why may we not say that all automata are engines that move themselves by springs and wheels, as doth a clock? Why do not all automata have an artificial life? Why do not all automata have an artificial life? For what is the heart but a spring? And what are the nerves but so many strings? And the joints but so many wheels? So just in the same way, Hobbes says art, meaning technology, goes further. By technology or creativity is created that great Leviathan called a commonwealth or a state, which is but an artificial man, though much bigger. And in the Leviathan, the sovereignty is the artificial soul which gives motion to it. And the magistrates and other officers of the state are the nerves which control it, like the strings in a clock. And blah, 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 blah. So he describes this idea of the state being a composite of the people within it. And then he says, to describe the nature of this artificial man, I will consider first the matter thereof, the people that make it up, and second, how and by what covenants it is made, so how it's manufactured. So this is slightly sneaky of him. So he's actually talking about two of the Aristotelian causes, so the material cause and the efficient cause. That is, what's the structure of something, and how does it come to be built, which is funny because much later in the book he's scathing about Aristotelianism, or at least scholastic Aristotelianism as it was interpreted in the 17th century. But nonetheless, he does actually use it quite a lot in its original form. Okay, so we have this idea of the state as this composite organism. And the question, remember, let's have a look at a biography. So the question is, because of these wars, the English Civil War and the 30 Years' War and similar, which Hobbes struggled through, he asks the question, how can this Leviathan be properly constructed so that it's not going to cause all of this suffering for people? So a bit of background. So Thomas Hobbes lived a really long time. So he was born in 1588 and lived in the 17th century to be 91 years old. 1580, so the story which he told was that in 1588, the year of the Spanish Armada, he was born early because his mother heard that the Spanish Armada was on the way and was frightened into giving birth to him. So that's the story anyway. And he was born in some village called Malmesbury in, I think, Wiltshire. That's a picture of a market monument, which is actually about 100 years older than Hobbes, and in the same place. So he would have seen that, and he would not, luckily for him, have had to have put up with all the clutter in the background of the television antenna and the endless street signs. So that's a picture of what the place might have looked like when he was there. He went to Oxford, and he was a very smart guy. He became the tutor to William Cavendish, so one of the Cavendish family who sponsored all kinds of scientific things at the time. And as the tutor to one of the Cavendishes, he went on a grand tour of Europe. And this is quite important because on his grand tour of Europe, I mean, he could read and write fluently Greek and Latin. He met with Galileo and he met with Descartes. And I put that up because Galileo in particular is, I think, quite influential on Hobbes. So this being the Renaissance, despite the fact that Hobbes is basically a political philosopher, he actually seems to have a pretty good physics brain, as I would understand it. So not only is he a hardcore materialist, but he's very fond of geometry. And in fact, when he talks about his foundation principles, he pretty much throws out the door starting points which have just been written down by theologians, but likes to talk about, when he's trying to work out his starting points, does like to talk about geometry and the principle that, well, not quite momentum conservation, but the idea that something will continue in motion unless a force acts on it. So it's not clear to me what that has to do particularly with morality. Well, it is. It's a very indirect concept that he's saying. Even the atoms and the motion of things in our brain is effectively controlled by laws of physics, and so he's saying my theory is going to come out of a materialist interpretation of what makes people what makes people go. Anyway, but he really likes geometry, and he actually wrote a book called something like, what have I got it written down here? Something like, I've lost it. It's something like principles and applied examples of geometry with simple explanations. So if Hobbes, a political philosopher, can write a book on maths questions, then we, as 21st century engineering students, can look at his philosophy. Why not, if you can study both of those things? So while he was off in Europe, Hobbes did a translation. His first, I think, significant published book was a translation into English of Thucydides, the famous Greek historian, and his work, The Peloponnesian War. Do you all know the history of the Peloponnesian War? No? Okay. So Thucydides, along with Herodotus, is one of the two key Greek historians. And Whereas Herodotus would, in his books, periodically decide to put in something a bit more interesting so that he could make a moral point. Thucydides was more concentrated on realism, and he was the historian who was most interested in realpolitik. So, politics as just the exercise of brute force of one organization on another. And so Thucydides talks about, in one of his influential writings, the Melian peace. So this is where the city-state of Athens had conquered the Isle of Mela, and it had enforced on it a brutal peace. And so Thucydides writes in the Melian peace, the strong take what they can, the weak suffer what they must. And so he had a pretty cynical view of people. And it's the same fundamentally cynical view of people which Hobbes has as a starting point for his morality in Leviathan. Although he, I think, comes to conclusions which are actually quite nice, but his starting point is essentially cynical about people, something like Thucydides. So, English Civil War is 1642 to 51. Hobbes went and lived in Paris for a lot of it, where he finished, it was not his first book on political theory, which was in Latin, but Leviathan he wrote in English, and published in 1651 at the end of this English Civil War. And it has this revolutionary new theory, which we'll look at what the theory is in a bit, but this ended up with the definition of Hobbesism. And Hobbes was described as both more lauded and decried than any other contemporary thinker. Hobbesism was often taken as almost as a curse word of some really bad thinking. So starting from this idea that people are completely cynical, it's suggested that this means Hobbes' theory itself is completely cynical and bad, which is a misrepresentation, but it's an easy misrepresentation to make. And part of the reason he got into trouble was because he managed to annoy everyone. So this is a good sign for any writer. He managed to annoy everyone because he defended absolute monarchy, just as the parliamentarians had won the English Civil War. But luckily his doctrine is quite flexible, and it can also be used to defend absolute rule by Parliament pretty much as effectively. Some people didn't like it precisely for this flexibility. They thought this is not picking a side in the way that you're supposed to. But while he defended absolute monarchy, he rejected a divine right theory. So the idea that the moral authority of having an absolute monarch is something that comes from the church. So he managed to, since most of the monarchists quite liked divine right theory, he managed to annoy them as well. And as a result, he was damn close to denounced for heresy by Parliament. Some of his later books were sort of censored, which is ironic because he was quite in favour of censorship. Or in fact, his book Behemoth, it was not technically censored. He agreed not to have it published until much later. Part of the reason he was nearly denounced for heresy is that his materialist attitudes were close to being considered atheism at the time, even though he does have in his book various roles for the role of God and the church in the state. The fact that he was using materialism as a starting point, they didn't like. So bits of his books involve him defending himself against these completely wrong accusations of heresy, and he was a smart guy, so he does, I think, manage to talk his way out of that. That's a problem. And just to show that he worked for a very long time, 1673 to 75, when he was 85 to 87 years old, he published the first English translation of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So he was pretty good at Greek, and was able to work for a very long time. And according to his biography, here's a couple of portraits of Hobbes. According to his biography, he was a handsome man. He had a mischievous glint to his eye, and he was over 6 feet tall, which was very tall for the time. So he enjoyed remarkably good health for the 17th century. So that's the setting. Now, before I get to the book, let me talk a bit about the character and tone of Hobbes's writing. So I banged on about materialism. Also, he has an empiricist epistemology. So this means, well, we'll come to this. He believes that what we can learn is fundamentally what is fundamentally based on our experiences of the outside world. So he doesn't believe in objective morality, which you can figure out by thinking about it. He thinks that what we can learn, and what we can learn about morality, is explicitly derived from experience. That's important because I'll argue in a bit, well, his argument runs that because our ethics, our morality are based on our experiences, and everyone has slightly different life experiences, or very different, therefore people don't necessarily come to have a shared common morality as a starting point from which you can design a political system. That's quite important. I'll come back to that. And he thinks, so Hobbes says instead of doing that, we'll try something more scientific, and a lot of his writing is actually extremely logical and involves a pretty much a deductive progression from his starting points to his conclusions about how you should run the state. And I like this. I came down close to writing equation numbers next to his statements when I was putting this on the slide, but I mostly resisted doing that. And I quite like Hobbes. Despite the fact bits of him are quite hard to read, I think part of the reason he writes long, complicated sentences, they're actually clean enough to read once you go and reread them again, having worked out what he was saying. Nonetheless, I do think this is part of the entertainment because there was no television at the time. So if you buy a book, you expect good value entertainment from it. So struggling through complicated sentences, obviously a selling point at the time. We'll see if you understand why this is English common sense. If I had read as much as other men, he liked to say, I would know just as little. I think this is a Hobbes saying, there's an awful lot of stuff written down which is complete rubbish. Nonetheless, not my book. It's excellent. On his deathbed, he said that I've spent 91 years trying to find a way out of this life, and at length I've found it. So, able to see the lighter side of situations. I quite like his spelling, so some of the time he blatantly is just playing with the fact that there was no strict dictionary, and so he would come up with some actually quite minor thing that somebody would do and say, well, he's had to be careful lest he scandalizeth his brother. It's just grossly overwritten. But I think hilariously so. Hobbes on his own writing style. So, give you a bit more of his writing. This is in the conclusions. He says, and this is what I mean by this is complicated. This is less direct than I'd get away with. If I wrote this in a paper, it'd get heavily edited. There is nothing I distrust more than my own elocution, which nevertheless I am confident, accepting the mischances of the press, is not obscure, that I have neglected the ornament of quoting ancient poets. So at the time, apparently people were expected to put in quotations in Latin or Greek or ancient proverbs to show the wisdom which their writing was based on. He says, I've not done that, and the reason I have not done that proceedeth from my judgment, which is grounded on many reasons. And he gives a long list, an unnecessarily long list. One good reason would have been enough, and his one good reason was essentially that good reasoning should be self-evident and logically clean. It should not depend on witnesses or proof from someone else's principles. But nonetheless, he carries on with his list for his own amusement. Fourthly, such opinions as are taken only upon credit of antiquity are not intrinsically the judgments of them that cite them, but are words that pass like gaping from mouth to mouth. So I'm going to use that next time I need to describe what an internet meme is. It is simply a concept which passes like gaping from mouth to mouth, without anyone bothering to fully understand the basis of it. It gets better. Fifthly, it is many times with fraudulent design that men stick their corrupt doctrine with the cloves of other men's wit. I'm going to use this. The next student who gives me a thesis which involves figure 1, here I've taken from a review paper a picture which describes what I'm trying to do in this dissertation. The next time somebody gives me a copy-pasted diagram, I'm going to get this quote and I'm going to write it out, that they have stuck their corrupt doctrine with the cloves of other men's wit. And that'll put a stop to them. And the best part, they won't even realise I've stolen it as a quote from someone. Seventhly, it is an argument of indigestion when Greek and Latin sentences unchewed come up again, as they used to do, unchanged. In other words, again, that's returning to the point number one, that you really ought to make your arguments clear from your own principles and logic, not fail to properly interpret and then quote something and hope, fingers crossed, that it justifies what you think you're trying to justify. Okay, so that's Hobbes' writing style. It's not actually the quickest to read, but it's entertaining, I think. Okay, so what is he writing about? So his new political theory basically replaces, it replaces scholastic Aristotle. So the previous thought-defining work on political theory was Aristotle's The Politics, which was duly taught at the time. Aristotle's argument, contrary to Hobbes' materialism, Aristotle's argument is that man is a political animal. So part of the nature of people is that we have an utmost aim. So this is a non-materialist thing. One of the purposes that people have, or something that we've evolved to do, or a purpose which you can't say it's not a particular material composition, it's the purpose, it's the objective, is to take part in political society. So that's one starting point of Aristotle. Combine that with, he did more or less take as a starting point that there are shared universal ethics. Well, I think he was chary of Plato. So, and to justify that, you can say, well, okay, you've got the writings of Plato. We're pretty sure there are universal correct ethics in some case. So one of Plato's or Socrates' key ideas that in a court case there really is a correct judgment as to who is the party guilty or not. And it's a struggle, but Aristotle says, okay, it's reasonable to take as a starting point that there are some universally acceptable ethics. So certainly in the room it would be not difficult to find plenty of things everyone agree is moral.